There's a lot of anger in the world today. Are you sympathetic to that anger, or are you feeling this anger is the wrong kind of anger?
I am sympathetic to the roots of the anger. I think anger is not a constructive response to problems that are quite real, and they are quite real. So take, say, the United States, which has suffered less from the policies of the last generation than other Western countries. But nevertheless, in the United States, median income, for example, is lower in real terms than it was 30 years ago. Right at the moment before the great crash, the peak of euphoria about the wonderful economy, real wages for American workers were lower than they had been in 1979 before the neoliberal period began. And this is duplicated over much of the world. This has been a massive assault on large parts of the population. It's been an assault on democracy, on a sense of participating. The result is not just anger, but contempt for institutions, decline of centrist institutions, which a large part of the population feels are just not responsive to them correctly.
And Trump has been the result of that.
Trump is one result of that.
Right.
Brexit is a result of that. Le Pen is a result.
And why do you think the response to the problem you've talked about of low incomes, why do people then jump to a Le Pen or a Trump rather than to Bernie Sanders or to the solutions you would advocate?
They jump to Bernie Sanders. The most remarkable thing about the last election was actually Bernie Sanders, not Trump. Bernie Sanders broke with a century of American political history. In American elections, back to the late 19th century, elections are basically bought, literally. You can predict with remarkable accuracy electability simply on the basis of campaign funding and also policies. There's very substantial political science research on this. Sanders came along, no support from the corporate sector, no support from the wealthy. The media simply dismissed him as ridiculous. He was basically unknown. He even used a scare word, socialist. And he would have won the Democratic nomination if it hadn't been for the shenanigans of the party managers. If you take a look at popularity today, he is far and away the most popular figure in the American political system.
Right, but the truth is Trump won the election, fair or not fair. What was the appeal of Trump? Why do so many people, particularly blue-collar, Rust Belt populations, why do they like him?
I've just given you the answer. Take a look at what's happened to them during
the
neoliberal.
But why Trump? I mean,
what is the alternative? The Democrats gave up on the working class 40 years ago. It's just the working class is not their constituency. No one is their. No one in the political system is. The Republicans claim to be, but they're basically their class enemy. However, they can appeal to people on the basis of non-economic claims about we're going to help you economically even when we kick you in the face, but claims about religion, white supremacy, a range of kind of what's called sometimes identity politics, which does a lot of. You take a look at the Trump voters. Some are working class, and incidentally, many of them voted for Obama in 2008. They believed Obama's rhetoric about hope and change. They were quickly disillusioned. There was no hope and there was no change. And in response, they've this group has turned to basically their class enemy because no one else is there to offer them anything. Then there's another sector, which is white supremacy is very deeply rooted in the United States. If you look at comparative study, there are comparative studies of white supremacy around the world. The United States ranks higher than even South Africa.
So you think there was quite a racist motivation?
There's no doubt about that. By
What
now, there's a lot
are we talking 3% of the voters,
well,
30%? Or
percent you can argue about,
but roughly,
it's a substantial streak. Fundamentalist religion is a substantial streak. Trump took an enormous quantity of the Christian fundamentalists, who are a big segment of the U.S. population. Remember, in the United States, about maybe 40% of the population think the second coming is going to be in their lifetimes. 2/3 think it's coming sooner or later. The United States is off the spectrum in this respect. So here's a big segment of voters that Trump was able to appeal to, not on the basis of his own positions, but because he's going to serve their interests, and they know it. Among white males, he was way ahead of Clinton. There's many factors, but one interesting factor is, in fact, the white working class vote, much of which went to Obama.
And then that didn't work for them well enough, so they went to the next thing that was different and changed.
The same claim. Obama claimed we're going to have hope and change. No hope and change, pick bankers and so on.
Do you think Trump will do much damage while he's there? And will it be permanent damage to the institutions of the US? Or do you think he'll be temporary phase?
The main damage he'll do is to the world, and it's already happening. The most significant aspect of the Trump election, and it's not just Trump, it's the whole Republican Party, is their departing from the rest of the world on climate change. It's a crucial issue. It's an existential threat. And now the United States, we have this astonishing spectacle of the United States alone in the world, not only refusing to participate in efforts to deal with climate change, but trying, dedicated to undermining them. And it's not just Trump. Every single Republican leader is the same. It goes down to the local levels. Take a look at the primaries. In the Republican primaries, every single candidate either denied that climate change is happening, or when you get to the so-called moderates like Jeb Bush and Kasich, they said, well, maybe it's happening, but we shouldn't do anything about it. That's 100% refusal. And this goes down to lower levels. Incidentally, roughly 40% of the population think it can't be a problem because Jesus is coming in another couple of decades.
I mean, you've called the Republican Party the most dangerous organization on earth.
In human history. There has never, it's an outrageous statement, and when I said it, I said, look, this is a very outrageous statement, but is it true?
But you're rating them worse than the Kim Jong-un of North Korea or ISIS, who are very...
Is ISIS dedicated to trying to destroy the prospects for organized human existence?
Right, is that bad, the Republican
Party?
Party?
Does it mean to say, not only we're not doing anything about climate change, but we're trying to accelerate the race to the precipice?
And you don't entertain the possibility that they may be genuine in their belief that this is...
Doesn't matter whether they genuinely believe it or not. The people who genuinely believe that Christ is coming in their lifetimes do genuinely believe it. But if the consequence of that is, let's use more fossil fuels, let's refuse to subsidize developing countries, let's eliminate regulations that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if that's the consequence, that's extremely dangerous. Unless you're living under a rock, you have to recognize the seriousness of this threat. The other threat is nuclear weapons, and they're very dangerous as well.
Just thinking about the cause of the divisions in society, what is creating these divisions, do you think the traditional classes, working class, the capitalist class, the owners and the workers, is that the most interesting division? Is that a good way of thinking about it these days, do you think, or is it out of date now?
Well, first of all, either you give orders or you take orders, and that's a big difference. That's always a difference. Either you own large parts of the world, or you rent yourself,
or is it more complicated?
or you rent yourself to the owners.
Maybe you own a little bit because you have a pension fund, or
Well,
you
don't own anything. What you own is a minuscule fraction of the ownership of corporations. Stock ownership is very highly concentrated, and not only concentrated but interlocked. So big banks own big pieces of different corporations and so on. Furthermore, if you look at ownership of the world economy is now in many ways a more dramatic index of a country's power than the traditional ones like GDP per capita. So, for example, there's a few studies that have just begun of the extent to which, say, ownership of the world economy is concentrated in particular countries. Turns out that U.S. corporations own about half the world economy.
But someone who owns the U.S. corporations, I mean, it's institutions who have multiple owners. Again, there's a very high concentration of ownership, and the institutions are, and if you go back to the actual enough ownership to actually control the corporation, it's often a group of big financial institutions and so on. Some have said that the divide now is a more cultural one between metropolitan internationalists, comfortable with immigration. They're called people who are happy anywhere, and people who are rooted in local communities and who are lodged somewhere. Is that not a fair?
There are plenty of divides. There's divides on religion, for example. There's divides on all sorts of things. But a fundamental divide is the class divide. And one of the reasons for the anger that you began with is because none of the institutions and none of the political parties are really representing the class interests of the large part of the workforce. And that does lead to great anger. There are other sources too, and I think in many ways the derivative from it. So, for example, the anti-immigrant hysteria in the United States, in England, elsewhere, is in part a reflection of the decline in opportunity that is the result of the neoliberal programs. When you have a large part of the population who have been either stagnant or declining, in fact a majority, for a generation, that's quite serious. It shows up even in mortality. So, for example, in the United States, as you may have seen recently, in the main working years, 25 to 50, roughly those years, there's actually an increase in mortality among white working people. That hasn't happened in industrial societies ever, except for famine or war.
What do you think of, people call it the Uber economy, it's called the gig economy here, an economy where you have very many self-employed people, they're kind of working for themselves, they're sort of working for a big company, much more arm's length relationships, more insecure work.
That's critical, and it's understood. And if you go back to the planners and the managers of the neoliberal economy, people like take Alan Greenspan, who, the Fed chair, who ran it in the United States up till practically up till the crash. He testified to Congress, the Senate Banking Committee, on the success of the economy that he was managing. And he attributed a good part of the success to what he called growing worker insecurity. He said growing worker insecurity has the effect that workers are too intimidated to ask for better wages, to go on strike, to ask for benefits. And the result is we can maintain what was called the Great Moderation, low inflation, high profits, and so on. Yeah, that's part of it. And the gig economy is an aspect of that. As you say, it's a precarious life. It's not a life of security. And therefore, it's a life in which you don't organize together to defend and extend your rights. You just try to survive. Now, there's a group that doesn't, namely the owners. They organize, they struggle, they control the political system. And what you see is the developments we've seen in the last generation. Extremely high concentration of wealth, stagnation or decline for a large part of the population, undermining of democratic institutions, anger, your first word is correct, anger at the fact that the institutions are not representative, they don't deal with me, a sense in large parts of the population that for the first time we're not moving forward. The image that's often used is that people see themselves as the Trump supporters, say that group, see themselves as standing in a line where they were supposed to be moving forward. Their parents worked hard, they did all the right things, their children were better off than their parents. All of a sudden the line has stopped. The people ahead of them are shooting up to the stratosphere, and then comes the scapegoating. The picture is that the government is working for those undeserving people behind us and trying to put them ahead of us. Affirmative action, food stamps, immigrants, and so on. And that's where the Trumps of the world come in. Yeah, we can blame those bad, undeserving people for your plight, not the people ahead of you in line who are really responsible for it. And we've seen things like this in history. I don't go along with those who say that we have incipient fascism, but there is a recollection of somebody who did the same thing.
Why don't you go along with those? Because there are plenty of people who say the 1930s is the parallel.
No,
you don't buy it?
I don't. I mean, there are no stormtroopers. There's no ideology. Trump's only ideology is me. That's quite different from Hitler and Mussolini. There's no organization, there's no fascist organization. It's a very different situation.
Yeah.
It's deeply authoritarian and very dangerous, but not fascism.
Macron won the French election, Emmanuel Macron, an internationalist, liberal, loves the EU, all the things in a way that the Trump voters have tried to reject.
Well,
do you think he can succeed? Is this the end of populism in Europe?
By no means. In fact, Macron is a good example of how the core institutions have collapsed. He came from the outside.
Yeah.
Okay, and the vote for him was substantially a vote against Le Pen, who is recognized correctly, I think, to be a serious danger. In fact, many people who voted for Macron were holding their nose. Not their choice.
What about the British election? Jeremy Corbyn has been leading the Labour Party. They have an uphill task, according to the opinion polls. Have you any advice, any thoughts about how Labour refines its pitch and makes it to government in the UK?
They should ask me to vote. I would vote for him. I mean, they have a problem. I think he's a very decent, good person. I've followed his career for some years. He's not, evidently not inspiring the population. How Labour could, Labour has not come out with its program, so we don't really know what it'll be.
But there's a sense of a lack of clarity about quite what he stands for.
That's right.
Which is odd, because he was someone who was more clear about what he stood for decades.
What's happened to the Labour Party over the last, through the neoliberal years. It became, as many call it, Thatcher Light, especially under Blair. It did not represent the working class.
Does it not have to split after the election? On your analysis, it's two parties, a neoliberal light party, a Thatcher light party, and a Corbyn party. They're not the same party.
No, they're not. and the Labour, and in fact it's split between the constituency and the parliamentary party. So the Labour Party has internal problems that it has to deal with, but it also has the problem of demonstrating to the electorate that it does represent their interests. The Democrats in the United States have the same problem. So, for example, if it hadn't been for the shenanigans of the party managers, the Obama-Clinton party managers, Sanders probably would have won the nomination and might very well have won the election.
I want to finish by...
These are internal problems to these decaying centrist institutions. And the anger that you talked about at first is a reflection of that.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about Julian Assange, just to finish, because you've been a big supporter of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And many progressive people have looked at WikiLeaks and said, this organisation is on the wrong side of history. I just wonder whether you still believe in Julian Assange, despite the fact that they published emails of Hillary Clinton stolen.
I believe that that the persecution of him is completely wrong. The threats against him are completely wrong. They should be withdrawn. He should be freed. He shouldn't have to be imprisoned. I visit.
Judicial process, though, yeah? I mean, he needs to be questioned about the accusations.
Pretty much a fraud.
Is it?
I think so. There's no reason why Swedish prosecutors can't interrogate him on the charge that they think they have. In fact, they've already begun to do so. What's keeping him in prison, and in
an
fact
embassy,
is in prison,
is his desire to go in there. No one sent him there.
The threat that the United States will go after him. Same thing that's keeping Snowden in Russia.
And is he right to worry about that threat?
Of course he's right to worry about it. And it's the threat that's wrong. As to what WikiLeaks is deciding to release, you can have various opinions. By and large,
what's your opinion of leaking stolen emails, perfectly legitimate emails, stolen and then put in the public domain?
If they'd asked me, I would have not been in favor of that. So I don't know how they decide what to leak and not, but leaking, the general idea of informing the public, informing citizens of what their representatives are doing and keeping from them, that's a good idea.
Noam Chomsky, thank you very much indeed.